Okay, thank you very much. So Wednesday, here we are. Welcome everybody. I think we have a few new people. Our sort of our approach here is just to do some informal overview, some updates on things, and do some introductions. Anyone new on the call who hasn't been here in a while can sort of do a quick hello, where you're from, what you're doing. That way we know who's here. And then we'll do a couple of updates on the scan. And Adam will take us through where we're at on that. And then we will actually, when Stephanie on yet? Stephanie or Mary? We'll talk about tomorrow's. Oh, hey, there you go. So she'll talk a little bit about the Michigan symposium that's going to be happening tomorrow that some of us are participating in. And then we have our featured guest. So Nancy Lush has graciously agreed to talk to us about heart and UMA tomorrow, a little later this afternoon after we get started on this. And it's one of the areas where we're focusing on discussing in the promising in the scan document. So we really look forward to hearing and discussing it. I know we talked about this a while ago, and very exciting, sort of interesting ways of addressing many of the issues we've been talking about here. So we'll spend about half hour, 45 minutes with presentation and discussion on that. And then we'll try to wrap up around 5:15 if we're diligent, responsible. Otherwise, we'll continue on a little bit longer if the conversation requires or warrants it. So with that, I invite you to put your video cameras on if you so dare. It's much nicer talking to people's faces, you see, but feel free to do that. Thank you. And you got extra points for it, so you'll be able to turn those in later for serious prizes. And it just makes it more fun while we're still sort of shackled to the the Zoom world. So so there's a couple of new folks, and forgive me if I've actually already introduced you once or asked you to introduce yourself. You can either do it again or just remind me. So I think they're Baron Serdar. I think you may be new here, or
yes, I am.
Good.
You want me to go ahead? Okay. Thank you for hello everyone, and thank you for including me in this meeting. I was recently made aware of this group. To give information about me, I'm trained as a physician, as a medical doctor, and I did work in public health. I was a faculty for many years in public health here in School of Public Health. I'm in Colorado. I'm trained at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I worked in epidemiology, environmental occupational health, doing research for many years. More recently, I was more sensitive about sensitive data exchange, and I am co-founder of Cloud Privacy Labs. It's a relatively new company, but we have some quite interesting new hot technology. Our flagship product, our starting point has been about consent management, exchanging sensitive data, substance use data, mental health data, and how to respect an individual's preferences while exchanging data. And more recently, we also have another focus where we do semantic harmonization of healthcare data or other data actually, and hopefully helping with interoperability. So we are located in Denver, Colorado. And I think that's it as an introduction. Thank you again.
Yeah. So welcome. And join in. There are a number of other physicians on the call who will join us, so you're in good company.
Thank you.
They keep our feet to the fire, which is excellent. Barak, I think if you would welcome again. Oh, you were here last week, right?
Yes, I was. Yes, I was here last week as well.
Yes, and just remind me.
Yeah, so with Baron, I'm the other co-founder of Cloud Privacy Labs, and we are working on consent and health data exchange and harmonization.
Thank you. My recall is wanting these days. too much sun, I guess, this summer.
Maybe there's a doctor who can help.
Thank you. Yeah, we can do some online memory tests here. See how well we all do on that one. That'd be exciting. Anyone new that I haven't or hasn't been here in a while? All right, I think we're all here then. So not all that much has transpired since last week, and where we heard a lot more about PP2PI, which is great and good, timely and good conversation around that work. Again, a component we're focusing on in the scan as well, so that helped really clarify some stuff for us as well. And so notes are on the hub. If you're not a member of the National Interoperability Collaborative Hub, or NIC, you can just sign up, and you can see other members on there. So if you haven't put your bio in there, or if some of you are on there, it's good to fill out your bio. We can see who else is involved, and then you can find your way onto the various Unify and consent sort of mini hubs in there. So that's a good place to connect yourself on there. And Amanda will put the link to that in case some folks are not on there already. So we've just been sort of heads down on the scan, sort of torturing everybody for their input and edits. And I think we're getting pretty close to at least a good final first good draft, which is terrific. And Adam has been championing that tremendously. So before I give you to the consent, Stephanie, do you want to talk a little bit about tomorrow's event and just let people know, and if there's a link for people to join or to follow it, that would be super as well.
Sure. Daniel threw this at me at the very last minute, so if I fumble, I'm going to blame him. I'm just kidding. So the Michigan Health Information Network every year pre-COVID did an in-person conference called Connecting Michigan for Health. When COVID hit us and we went virtual, they too took the conference virtual. And this year, instead of having one giant conference over a course of 3 or 4 days, they split it up into individual workshops. So tomorrow is the e-consent workshop that is part of the Connecting Michigan for Health conference series. And I will, when I'm done chatting, when I'm done talking, I'll find the link and send it. It's mostly focused on the Michigan footprint. So we have our privacy officer, chief, I think her actual title is Chief Policy and Privacy Officer, will work through how MyHIN is participating in that e-consent space. But this group, Ed Daniels from Point of Care Partners, our Mary Kratz, Daniel, and Dr. David Wang have a session during this tomorrow morning to talk about what we're doing on a larger scale, so not just within the state of Michigan, but more across the U.S. and how we can not only leverage e-consent for healthcare, but also for the link to health and human service information. And that's at 9:30 Eastern. Tomorrow is the presentation with Mary, Ed, Daniel, and Dr. Wang. I believe the whole day starts at 9 a.m. And I'm happy to share that information in the chat.
Can I assume, Stephanie, can we assume that it'll be recorded in case somebody cannot make it but wants to see it?
I am almost positive it will be recorded, but I will double check on that and let you know before the end of the call.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. And this is really a good opportunity for us to be sort of talking about the work we're doing here, Unify, how we're coming together various ways with Interoperability Institute and MyHIN, and just the convergence of areas. So there's localized, which is great, a localized all the way up to national, and so it's appreciate the opportunity to join in that conversation. And as our story continues to evolve, it helps be able to tell it to others so that they understand it as well. So so that's that. Adam, do you want to give kind of an update and sort of tasks.
I can do it pretty briefly too. So the very, and one more very good news is that it's really coming together. Those of you who've been with us for all these months, for the 100th time, but we mean it, sincere, big thanks. I mean, this is a bizarre undertaking in the way that we approached it, with probably dozens of you feeding into a document. Some of you, really devoting huge time, which we're really grateful for. But in any case, I mean, look at the people just on this call. We have dozens of genuine deep subject matter experts, all feeding into the same document. So, my task in putting it together really is making sure that all the pieces make sense, that there's flow, that they're understandable for lay folks, all the chores of an editor. But it is a pleasure, and I'm learning so much from the exercise. And again, the good news is that it looks like it's really going to happen amazingly. The scary part for, here's the Grim Reaper coming at you, it's probably going to be 100 pages. I think we're going to have to thoughtfully figure out how to segment it, present it, so it doesn't look oppressive and people can bite at it in chunks. And next week I'll write an executive summary, which is probably all that most people are going to read anyway. But it's strong content. Those of you who have fed into it or read it, I think, and have sent me really nice notes about it, know that, and I think it's going to be a valuable piece of work. So I think it's probably 70–80% done, and there's a chance I'll finish it this week, depending on how much input I get from whom and when. But we're nearing the finish line, and I think the product looks strong. So the other two things I'll say is that we've got a designer working on it now, so that part is happening as well. And I'll speak to the IRB, and then just finish with one more thought. So thank you again to Paul Meisner for turning us on to this group that serves as a sort of on the ground community perspective IRB. They do their work seriously in a methodical way, but they come at it not just from an academic perspective, but from a people with lived experience, community served perspective. We had a good meeting with them several days ago. They asked us excellent questions, and then tip of the hat to Daniel, who thought of a very good way to use this group, which consists of an epidemiologist and lawyer and a social worker. And I mean, they cover the bases, the diversity basis in many ways. And Daniel had the idea of essentially in a modified focus group, rather than we're not really giving them a piece of research to review. We're almost done, and it's not real research, it's a scan. But what we'll do is bring a bunch of them together to talk about the subject matter, to provide input about about the paper when we give it to them, what are the important pieces from their perspective, and then I will take what they say and incorporate it as a section of the report. Here's what the voices on the ground have to say about the issues that we're tackling. So I think that'll be a clean, smooth way to do it, to get that kind of input, and I think it'll genuinely enhance the product. So again, thank you, Paul. And the last thing I'll say, I'll be Columbo, I'll be back. The last thing I'll say is that we still want your eyes on it. Nancy Lush and Nancy, I'll send you a follow-up if you could take a look at the section we're just writing on what you're presenting on. If you could provide content so that we make sure that we are reflecting your work accurately and so forth, and I can work with you if you have the time and bandwidth. That'll be real helpful. But this goes for everybody. At this point, I think we primarily want people reading to make sure you don't get, we haven't made any errors. Everything is clear. Nothing flagrant is missing. So hopefully not a heavy lift at this point, but we can certainly use as many eyes as we've got who have the time and inclination to look at it. If you don't have a link to the, Amanda, you want to put a link to the paper, the report in the chat, in case anybody doesn't have it. And again, I'll just end by saying thank you. I mean, we literally couldn't have done it without you, and I think the product reflects just how much wisdom we have here.
Thanks, Adam. And how much more information there is out there. It's been Herculean in a way, but it's great. Thanks for all your work on that as well. So unless anyone else has any updates or something that they want to share, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy. But now would be a good time, just thoughts on your mind or anything anyone wants to announce. Okay. But with that, Nancy, I think I gave you co-hosting, and I'm on. I could either, I think I can spotlight for everybody. There you go. You know, thanks for making time to share with us. I know Brian and I spoke with you, it seemed like months ago, to get a sense, and your participation has been great to inform us about Hart Newman and how you're going about solving some of the real problems very pragmatically. So we're particularly interested in that, your perspective on it, and as I mentioned to you earlier, how it connects. So much of what we found so far is all healthcare focused, right? It's all clinical healthcare mostly, pointing towards other areas. And what was the intriguing part about our conversations has been the the transition to other areas and how we can do that effectively and efficiently. So with that, the steering wheel is yours.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm actually going to stop my video while I'm doing that. So let me just do that. And I'm going to go to my slides. Give me 1 minute.
Nancy, do you want questions during the presentation?
I think I will hold them to the end unless somebody feels that they really would like to ask a question at that point in time. All right, so let me just get my screen cleaned up here a little bit. Okay, right. So Daniel asked me to speak today and provide an overview of both Hart and UMA. And he kind of snuck in there at the last minute. He'd like me to talk a little bit about the application for his particular user story. So first of all, my name is Nancy Lush. My company is Patient-Centric Solutions. So let's start by talking a little bit about the Thompson family. So this is a diagram that Daniel provided. And we have kind of a complicated use case here. So we start with their son, Jameson, who's age 10. And his mother is age 29. And she just had a car accident. And as part of that car accident, it was discovered that she was driving under the influence. And so she's currently in rehabilitation for both alcohol and drug abuse. So poor Jameson is now in guardianship, and the current guardian is his grandmother, Ruth. He also has a sister, age 3, Madison, and his father, John, is not very involved in the family. And as you can imagine, he has a number of issues around this. So I know a lot of people in this call already know the story. I'm sure I'm not doing it justice. But this story was new to me just a couple of days ago when Daniel shared it with me. And, it's complicated. So from both a medical and social services perspective, how do we actually support this family? So in my experience, a good way to start is kind of chunk it down into manageable pieces. Define solutions for chunks of like problems, and then overlay those to work out how they can come together. And a little bit of a spoiler alert, I do not have all the answers, but I think we do. I think we do have an understanding of good potential solutions for many of the chunks of problems that we're going to be encountering. So with that, we'll need to be building a system that works for the Thompsons. As we address a patient-centric solution, we'll weave together the technologies with healthcare challenges. And we need to do this in a way that combines the right technologies to enable more interoperability while increasing security and patient privacy. We need to build that bridge to trust while we also enable sharing across care facilities. And in terms of the underserved, I'd really like to point out that so many of these folks have a basic lack of trust. So as we seek to solve these issues, we'll benefit by finding patient-centric plans and engaging both family members wherever possible. So seamless interoperability has been the goal and vision from the early days of enabling medical records electronically. This goal has long been evading us. There were several blocks to this vision which have recently been solved, enabling implementation of these solutions. I believe we're now at that inflection point where these goals can become a reality. So with that, I'm going to jump right in and talk a little bit about UMA and HEART. So first of all, when we started the HEART work group in, I guess it was 2015, 2016, it was a group sponsored by ONC. And there were a number of challenges that HEART was intended to address. So some of these gaps include, the situations where a patient needs to see a specialist outside of a healthcare system. And too often there are long delays before that specialist gets access to the patient record. Sometimes a patient wishes to share the health data with a spouse or an adult child. A patient may choose to share her health data with a research organization. A new provider wants to provide care, but doesn't have access with current diagnosis or treatment history, and so much more. So the pain points in this are the human perspective. There's frustration and waste of time. Patients repeatedly complete long paper forms from memory. There's a lack of patient access to their own consolidated medical record, and physicians waste time trying to find all the relevant medical information. And then we have the negative impacts of care. So patients often don't remember and unable to provide accurate medical data when asked. Physicians are forced to make decisions without complete accurate information, potentially leading to inappropriate treatment. And repeat tests are both costly and just simply not always required. So why HEART? HEART was created to address these gaps and challenges. It enables the patient to safely share their health records with users of their choice in an interoperable way that respects and honors patient security and privacy. It enables patient-directed sharing of their clinical data. So what is HEART? People often ask this question. So it stands for Health Relationship Trust. And it's a set of profiles that enable patients to control how, when, and with whom the clinical data is shared. The HEART model builds on existing state-of-the-art security and adds additional components to ensure that patient clinical data is securely exchanged. In addition to giving patients control over how their own data is shared, HEART defines the interoperable process for systems to exchange patient-authorized healthcare data consistent with open standards, and specifically with FHIR API, OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, and user-managed access, also known as UMA. So there are a number of benefits to HEART. I'm going to be talking about 7 key benefits. First of all, HEART enables patient-directed sharing across a wide ecosystem. This use case was something that was really developed out of the PASSIO work group together. And it talked a little bit about, or basically had a data repository or a data hub. And the data around a patient was written back and forth to the data hub. And in the story, we have a patient, Betsy, who starts with an ELTSS care plan, and something happens. She's admitted to the hospital for a chronic episode of care. The hub pulls in the data from the local HIE. So by the time she gets to the hospital, all of the information is available to her that's at the HIE. And during her stay at the hospital, any updated data gets written back to this data hub. Then she goes to the skilled nursing facility. And again, any data that's occurred to date is available at that skilled nursing facility. And by the time she leaves the skilled nursing facility, the hub is again updated. And so her patient focused record travels with her as she goes from facility to facility. So this is just one example of how this might be applied. But I took the advantage of using that same diagram and updating it to basically support the underserved. So this is a data hub to support the underserved, and we'd show sharing across the wide ecosystem. So what might this look like? So I can imagine for the use case of the Thompsons, we'd have the child welfare case manager involved. We'd have a primary care provider, probably a psychologist, likely teachers or perhaps employment services. If there are foster parents involved, they would be involved in this data. Family court, behavioral health services. But really, very importantly, the patient and their family and family caregivers would also have access. So a second benefit is the patient controls who has access to the data. So it gives patients control over how their data is shared. Electronic consents define the patient sharing wishes. Authorization is based on patient-specified policy. It enables multi-party sharing. Authorization is provided asynchronously, and the patient makes a decision on who has access to their data. HART also works in conjunction with best practice security standards. So in any of these exchanges, we want to know that our patient, whether it be Alice or Jonathan, we want to know that the patient is the patient we think she is. And we want to know that the user requesting information is who they say they are. Ideally, users are identified through identity assurance. They only need to be identity proof once for that to apply to a high level of authentication. The user can be authenticated through high-level trusted authentication systems. So oftentimes when I do these presentations, I include a section on identity and authentication. However, in the interest of time, I won't be doing that today, other than to say that these are highly complementary and one tends to support the other. Another benefit. So HART provides granular management over protected resources. So it has the ability to control data of who, what, and how at a very fine grain. It might be which resource, what scopes, what level of sensitive data, or more, depending on how it's defined. Another benefit of HART is that it leverages existing open standards, as I already mentioned. So it supports FHIR and Smart on FHIR. It uses OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, and user managed access. And both the HART patient and provider clients are easy to use. So the patient, in this case, Alice, would create a policy to share with Dr. Erica. She selects her sharing preferences and presses share. So patient sharing is just that easy. And not only are the workflows and UX intended to be easy, but care was given to the standards design to make it easier for the protocol workflows as well. So it's actually easy to implement. And HART also supports data segmentation for privacy, one of the key points that I think this group is interested in. So HART included profiles for confidentiality and sensitive data. This work was done in conjunction with SAMHSA and the Consent to Share project and the data tagging projects, with the intent to support data segmentation for privacy. So HART allows data to be exchanged dynamically while honoring patient privacy. So this is a summary of the HART benefits. And HART really is a unique standard that delivers an elegant solution to these challenges. There's a recorded webinar that further delves into the details of each of these bullets that I'll make available to you after the presentation. And there are a number of HART implementations that I'm aware of. There may be others as well. So some of the earlier ones was EMR Direct, the HIE of one, and my other company, Lush Group, had an early implementation called Healthy Me PHR. We've simply recently replaced that with Patient Share out of Patient-Centric Solutions. And Adendos also has an offering, and while it's not actually a HART offering, they have implemented UMA in the healthcare industry. And that's called Federated Privacy Exchange, and it's in operation in Ontario. So while the HART work group currently meets very infrequently, the UMA work group continues to be active under the Conterra initiative. So this group is a great group of talented worldwide experts who continue to further this important work. And really would recommend anybody that's interested, please join the group and get involved. They continue to do deep dives into applicable topics. A couple of them that I think would be of interest is this UMA Business Legal Technical area, and it really talked about use cases and framework and the business model graphics, and it ties together kind of consents and policies and a number of very interesting aspects. And again, I'll give you links to this at the end of the presentation. It also supports delegation. So you might think that not all patients can manage their own policy, or maybe they don't even choose to. So for instance, perhaps an older and incapable patient might decide to delegate her sharing policies to her spouse, or perhaps to an adult child. It could even be delegated to a care coordinator, or perhaps a clinician at the primary care facility where she gets service. In the case of a child, perhaps at birth, we'd automatically delegate to the parent, probably likely, or other use cases along that paradigm. So basically, this involves a process to transfer those administrative rights to manage the sharing. So now HART as it applies to data privacy. So HART applies it does apply to data privacy and has direct applicability to SDOH, as I know many of you are involved with. So UMA and HART support granular sharing, and that level of granularity can be defined. Security profiles support the privacy granularity, and HART defines a standard for secure dynamic interoperability by connecting patient consent to the FHIR API. It's kind of the glue that kind of holds this all together. These are example of the HART security scopes that we implemented at the beginning of the HART work group, but these really can be extended to support whatever is supported in our value sets. So for instance, it certainly can be extended to support scopes around social determinants of health, or perhaps child protection sensitivity and those sorts of things. These are some of the existing technologies in support of privacy interoperability. So as you're all well aware, we have electronic consents. So examples of that are consent to share by SAMHSA, which we were involved in that project. Also patient share by our company. Identos also has the digital wallet, which is a very interesting product. And then we have the consent management systems. Another important technology are the value sets. So these were originally created by SAMHSA and they map to different sensitivity levels. We have FHIR tagging and redaction engines. We have HART and UMA to manage that secure interoperable exchange. And then FHIR APIs. We also have trusted identity servers and related standards. Just 1 minute, I lost my earphones. Okay. So I do want to say a little bit about our current challenges and progress. So one of the current challenges is the maintenance of value sets. And as I mentioned earlier, these were originally created by SAMHSA, but SAMHSA has not been continuing to support those value sets. They do need to be reviewed, updated, and supported. And so there are organizations currently looking for stewards of those value sets. We do need to have them maintained in order to have dependability and standardization in our exchange. Another area is the encoding of data segmentation encoding. And what we found is that most data coming, or much of the data coming from FHIR APIs are actually not encoded. So that becomes a challenge for using these value sets. There are also a number of AI proposals around to actually encode that data. But I'd like to point out for some of our more recent projects, the IGs are specified in a way that the data using these IGs is actually encoded. So for instance, with the PASSIO work group, which is post-acute care interoperability, and I'll specifically point, they have a number of different IGs, but I'll point specifically at the assessment data. So all of those are totally driven by well-defined LOINC codes. So it would be easy to create a value set for the LOINC codes used in these assessments. And that would be something that would be easy to apply sensitivity levels to. The case is similar for the ELTSS IG, that's electronic long-term services and support plans. And again, this IG is all encoded, so we could apply value sets and have some amount of dependability that indeed the data is all encoded. And the same is true for social determinants of health. These work groups are again, working on the IGs, and all of their key data elements are encoded. Back to the challenges. So policies, as you could imagine, there are many conflicts about policies, and we need resolutions to these. So the good news is, and I know you heard from Hannah last week, the PP2PI working group, which stands for Protecting Privacy to Promote Interoperability. So this group has a large group of very talented people, all working together to address a lot of these issues and others as well. So I'd like to kind of give kudos to the PP2I working group. And when I think of policies, if you think of public policies, that might be at the federal level, the state level, and also the local level. And so they vary and can get complicated. We also have policies at the organizational level. So a healthcare system might have their own policies. HIEs tend to have their policies as well. But in terms of patient-mediated exchange, we're really using patient policies. And the premise here is that patients have the right to their own data. And if they have the access to their own data, they also have a right to share their data as they wish. So with patient-mediated exchange, it's the patient that's actually defining the sharing policy. They can define who has access to the data, what parts of the data they have access to, for how long, and it can be revoked. And then, of course, that can be combined with delegation, as we mentioned earlier. So this is all driven by a computable patient consent. The patient or the delegate decides who has access to data. The consent becomes the policy that dictates what exchange is allowed. In our implementation, the transparency feature also provides insight into when and by whom consents were created and has accessed what part of Betsy's record. So this is an example of a simple consent. So, we see the same consent on the left where she's chosen to share all of her data. And then on the right, she can also share data at a granular level. And for this particular paradigm, we're allowing Betsy to share her data at a granularity of certain fire resources. So again, you can see on the right, she can share, share all or at the granular level. She can define that consent duration, and she can revoke it at any time. So while this is one paradigm that we've implemented, you can see a similar paradigm on the right implemented by consent to share. And in this particular case, they've chosen to share by sensitivity levels. And they've divided the UI up by federal categories and state categories. And on the federal level, they can share by drug use information and alcohol use and alcoholism information, and also by state categories, mental health information, HIV or AIDS information, communicable disease information, and security and protective health information. So really, either of these paradigms can be applied to HART and UMA. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the UMA user experience opportunities. So for instance, a user could opt in at runtime. They could also share their data ahead of time. This is the consumer, by the way, user. They could approve after the fact. They could get a request and then approve it. And they could monitor it anytime. And they can also withdraw consent anytime. So kind of a summary of benefits for individuals or say consumers or patients. They have a choice in sharing with other parties. They have a convenient sharing approval with no outside influence. They can make their own decisions. It can be centralizable and monitored and managed. And they have control of who, what, and how at a fine grain. So normally this is the end of my slides, but I'd like to talk a little bit about what some of the building blocks to actually achieve this for the kind of use cases that this group is considering. And so I think at the core, of course, we have a data hub or repository. We're assuming that would be connected with a FHIR API. We'd be connected with trusted IDPs, so we know that authentication is securely done and we can depend on that. We'd tie it together with UMA and HART and consents along with delegation. Provider directories are also very helpful in identifying the endpoints where data is shared. I'm assuming that most of these use cases would be using data segmentation, and of course the policies integrated with all of that. So together, I think these technologies can provide secure, seamless, privacy-honoring exchange. And I want to talk a little bit about a recent project we worked on with the Missouri LEAP. We just demonstrated this in the most recent Connectathon. And I'll tell you a little bit about this use case. So they had an adult man, 28 years old, and he had developmental disabilities. And like so many young people in his situation, he had never held a job. So the state of Missouri has identified quite a large number of folks in this area who are really interested in working, who are capable of working, and who in fact would have a better overall life if they were working. So the user story here is we have this adult man, Henry, and the objective is to try to find a job for him. So the case management system created an ELTSS plan, and it was really focused on finding a job for Henry. It's a person-centered plan, and so it really focuses on the qualities, the strengths that Henry has, his personal goals, and then they put together a plan to help him find a job and also help improve his health in particular areas. So that ELTSS plan was sent to the data hub. And then the data hub pushed that information, first of all, to SetWorks. Now, this is interesting, I think, to your point, Daniel. SetWorks is not a clinical provider. they provide services for this group of clients, but this particular service is an employment service. So the data plan is provided to SetWorks. All that information is taken into account while they find the ideal job for our patient, Henry. And at the same time, the data is pulled by an EMR. In this case, it was played by Station MD, which is a primary care provider in Missouri. So they pulled the data down to inform their care of Henry. And we showed care collaboration, where each of these organizations were all involved in collaborating on both helping Henry to improve his overall health, helping him to find a job. At the end of the day, he does get a job, and we see him 3 months later, and he has a new strength now. He turns out to be a very reliable worker. He's a hard worker, and he's really, moved along in his life and his holistic values. So this is just an example that we did for the Missouri LEAP project. But I kind of wanted to point out that the care plan could be used as a vehicle to exchange with other entities. And I can imagine our Thompson family, where, we might identify, these are potential needs that might be identified. So for instance, he might need assistance with becoming more accepted in the new school. So he might be reaching out to the school to help with that area. He also might need targeted therapy or education, helping him to learn how to hang with the right kids and avoid drugs and alcohol. Similarly, the full medical record might be shared with a primary care provider, and then other members of the care team might have access to other parts. And another advantage to this is that you can use SMART or HEART clients can be accessed in non-clinical settings. So because Smart on Fire clients could be either a web-based client or an app-based client, they can access data securely without having to be part of an EMR. So it kind of opens up the paradigm to more users involved in the holistic care for the patient. And I think I'll just give you a little idea of what an implementation might look like. So for instance, the core might be a data hub, and that might include a data repository of the required data. I'm kind of assuming that your use cases would want to use data segmentation, and it would be an UMA-enabled FHIR API. On the right side, we'd have a trusted identity provider. We want to validate that everyone's authenticated to be who they say they are. And then the authorization server would both support a consent system and user managed access. And so a HEART or UMA clients would then access the data by talking to these various components. This would include a FHIR client, a patient data viewer, and also a consent editor. So the way the workflow would go is the user would use this client, and they might reach out to that FHIR endpoint looking for certain resources on our patient, whoever the patient might be in this case. And the information would come back, pointing them back up to this authorization server. The first thing the authorization server does is sends it off to the trusted identity provider so we can get authenticated and validate that indeed this user is who they say they are. Then we interpret to see whether or not there is a consent for sharing data, or particularly the data that is being requested. Assuming all of the checks and balances match there, a token is released back down to the client, indicating that they do have access. That client then goes back up and hits that FHIR API. That data hub endpoint also goes back to the authorization server to validate the provided token, and that comes back when it's validated. And assuming all the stars align, the data is then shared with that client. So it sounds a little complicated, but all this happens instantaneously in a very secure, privacy supporting way. And then before I close, I just want to say that we have a lot of resources that are available if you want to have more information. So it's been a while ago now, but we did ONC sponsored a HEART webinar. I have links to all of these slide decks and webinars on my website. So I can give you all of these links, but actually if you go to our website, patientcentricsolutions.com/resources, I have all the links there in addition to many more, and we do keep adding them there. So if you're interested in delving more into this, these kinds of technologies, feel free to access that there. So any questions?
Nancy, this is Tom. I have a quick question. You mentioned earlier about use of a care plan as sort of the currency for some of this information, specifically the Missouri project. are there any examples that you're aware of where a variant on the care plan might also be exchanged? I'm thinking about, the particular use case that you're talking about where perhaps an individualized education plan might also be involved.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that's absolutely the case. And I think so. So one of my questions, a lot of the hard work is done around a FHIR API, but you could certainly put up other APIs. And I don't know whether schools have APIs for the IDPs, or exactly what how that's available in a standardized way. But if it were, certainly can be applied. So UMA applies. HEART was really designed to focus on the FHIR resources, but UMA supports the same paradigms. And so you certainly could use that to exchange other kinds of data. And UMA has been implemented in many other industries.
Perfect. Thank you.
There's a question from Rishon.
Yeah, sorry guys about the lack of video. Good afternoon. My quick question, of course, because this is a struggle for many of our organizations. So seeing this as a quick fix is an amazing feat. But where you have implemented this, who specifically were involved in the implementation? Which ecosystem actually got involved? And I think what I'm looking for is that community health school data sharing, utopia that this that this tends to connect. And I wanted to know if that exists and what your challenges were, if it does exist, and how you got around MOUs and how did the conversation start?
Yes. So first of all, we do not have any implementations at this time. Excuse me just a minute. So that's a limitation on our part. Frankly, we had a number of interesting things happening, and when COVID hit, there were a lot of these new pilots all coming into play, and they just said we have to stop. So we're at the place now where we're just starting again. The Missouri LEAP is interested in doing this exchange. We haven't really discussed whether or not they'll be using the hard aspect of it. So they're exchanging the ELTSS, but we haven't decided whether or not they'll actually use UMA or hard. A lot of this is really very new. So those discussions are newer as well. However, we have had many discussions with different organizations. They're just not actually implemented. We've talked a lot with community health centers. We think that that's a really important need and a niche where there's a lot of applicability. There's also a lot of applicability around, people with similar chronic issues, populations where they're doing a lot of transitions of care, where we really need to exchange that data. Anyway, so in behavioral health, of course, is one area where they're simply not exchanging data in the areas of behavioral health because they don't have a way to effectively not share certain sensitive information.
Thank you.
So Nancy, this is Ken. And so
hi, Ken.
Congress, hi, Congress changed the way Part 2 works now, right? And they just extended the deadline to implement it by a year or two or whatever, but which uses HIPAA TPO to exchange behavioral health information. And you do that through an opt-in. You get out of it by doing an opt-out, but and just like in previous worlds, right? There's no clawbacks. If you consent to share something, it's out there for the rest of the duration of that particular share. Even if you say I don't want to share anymore the next day, right? That's still out there.
Yeah. Once you've shared your secret, you can't pull it back, right?
Exactly. So my thought that we need segmentation still really, I think, is gone by the wayside. One of the reasons why the value sets are not updated and so on and so forth, because it's just relegated to a basic opt-in, opt-out. And if you opt in, you share everything. If you opt out, you share nothing. So there's no in between anymore about well, I'll share this part of my substance use data or that part of my, mental health data or whatever, right? Now, how state laws address it over time is a different issue, right? But from a federal perspective, part 2 is going to an opt-in, opt-out paradigm. So,
right. I mean, that's kind of the way it's been, opt in, opt out. And also, if you want to get treatment, you have to opt in.
right.
So it kind of doesn't really recognize patients' needs and patient privacies. And that's why I think we still need, I still think we need data segmentation. I think we need these solutions. And I think, we need to continue our work.
Yeah. The problem is going to be whether providers accept that notion or not.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure they won't, but because they never wanted to do it anyway. But
well, so some do, and I think it's kind of a matter of doing the right thing. And I think the work that the PP2 PI group is working on, I think it's just great work.
Yep.
And hopefully we'll find some good solutions for this.
well,
There are people out there that want to do the right thing.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with you. I'm just saying the law is not on our side anymore.
I see. Yep.
So,
Per the ONC, prefer that rule, right?
indeed. So that's all my comments. Thanks.
Thank you.
Adam, did you have a comment there?
Yeah, I have a question. It's for Nancy, but others can weigh in on it for sure. Looking at the more granular consent form, right? When somebody, so all of us have gone to doctor's offices and signed consents, or other places and signed consents, and they can be 3 paragraphs long, they can be 3 pages long, and we take about the same amount of time to read each one, right? Which is to say, I sign at the bottom because I want to get in the door and get out the door. I think that's probably typical experience. What we're talking about is really retraining people, in a sense, to say, you have this power, you have this authority. Please think about it, because it ain't going to be just, unless you want to opt in or opt out, in which case you're in the same place you've always been. But if you want to take that seriously, and we all would say people should take it seriously, how do we address, and I'm guessing your solution doesn't address, but thoughts about how do we address sort of burnout? How do we overload? Somebody who's got, care coordination that includes that includes a gamut of stuff. And numerous, possible providers and their subcontractors who will also get information. How do you retrain people and not to feel overwhelmed, overloaded by these options that we're going to put in front of them and say that this is best practice to give you all these opportunities? But how do you deal with inequities that give people, people with less education are going to have, and just time management for doing all of this?
Yeah. So
I know it's a big question, but it's certainly something we're all going to have to address.
Right. So there are a lot of questions embedded in that question. And it's challenging, right? So I think the UX is terribly important. We need to keep it simple. We need to really test it and see how it works. We've had a number of thoughts of, how it would be implemented. There are some folks that are implementing it by, like, you wouldn't share with each individual physician, but more as an organization. And you might be able to do that. In some cases, you maybe don't want to share with the whole organization. So you may have that, one of the docs at that practice is your next door neighbor, and you really don't want them to know that information. So you do need the ability to have that level of control, but it will be challenges as we put it together. One of the concepts I like, and actually we had come up with this earlier, was more of a federated level of consent. So the consents are all in one place and we manage it all in one place. I'd really like to see that. And that's kind of goes along with the data hub concept. At least we have the consents all in one place. We provide that transparency. We can see what all the consents are, and we can, edit them as we need to. The other concept we've had is to have the patient define, once the patient gets into the system, they would define their care team. We make it very easy with a provider directory. They define who the care team is, and now they have the right to, offer the same sharing with everybody in their care team. And if they then want to go down and edit it at a finer level, they could. So there's lots of different ways to do this. we've all had a lot of experience with user interfaces. You know, computers have been around for a while. We've had some good user interfaces and bad user interfaces. I don't think we're there yet in how to handle this situation, but I believe it can be done.
Yeah, I think that just generally speaking, I think there's an education component of this that we don't really address. It's
Right.
really all about how do you make it operational and simple and accessible, but not necessarily is anybody going to do it. And they need to understand why it's beneficial to do it. I mean, if they
Right.
just think it's one more bureaucratic task, you know, I'm going to check the box, just take it all. And that doesn't really, and that doesn't meet the purpose of why we're doing it.
So certainly-
There's also an educational challenge on the flip side that you referred to a few minutes ago, Nancy, with and Ken, of, you know, will providers accept the segmented data and the assignment of access to their data? You know, I'm COO of an HIE, and we look all the time at, you know, who gets user credentials and what role are they in. And essentially what we have found in a practical world is that if you say only the clinical staff can have access, they give their passwords to their medical assistants and their front desk staff, because those are the people they want to have access to the data for.
Right. Yeah.
And so,
And we'd rather not do that. We'd rather do it properly, but in a way that's easy for the patient as well.
Right. And so the education side on that provider side and on how to deal with managing those provider directories and who who it makes sense to give access to or not is also a huge challenge in implementing something like this.
I agree.
Floor is open. I've got a few questions, but I want to just, ask people, especially from other sectors or have different sort of perspectives on this. You mentioned a number of different things. And part of our conversation, Nancy, was, how to move data also from the system into other systems like education, or like into a school nurse that might need it, or to move some information into child welfare information about healthcare or drugs or prescriptions or whatever that is. And I'm interested in as we go forward, because one of the things that Dr. Gavin said last week was, while they're defined really wonderful use cases on PP2PI, she was pretty clear that their roadmap is several years away, and it does not currently deal with SDOH. There's still a lot going. I mean, there's still overwhelming amounts of just on the clinical data side for healthcare. And so I'm an anxious person around, getting stuff happening while there's time and resources and people. So I guess some thoughts about that, I think it would be important in terms of how do we actually move into and recognize that, human services are not FHIR enabled right now. Education, I think Dwayne is on the call here. You can speak more directly to, what the different educational information systems can provide or have been asked to provide, and there are multiple ones in every system. So there's some bigger questions about sort of moving from sort of model to proof of concept to actually demonstrate that. So let me open the door to your response and other people's response.
I would certainly like to say, as I said earlier, chunk it down into pieces, find pieces that are workable and get them implemented so people can see how they work and really begin to explore the viability. I mean, we have to run pilots on this stuff. It's still early, right? Yeah. So that, and then I think that's kind of why I was suggesting the ELTSS data set, because that's a care plan. I mean, if I can actually demonstrate what that care plan looked like for the Missouri LEAP, but it really showed, a little bit about Henry's goals, his strengths, and that was something that's pretty viable to share. So, you might not share, there might be certain aspects of the medical record that you want to share broadly with everyone, but if you can share that at a granular level, it makes sense to share it with the appropriate people. So that's certainly something that can be shared with a school with some of the needs that I addressed in my presentation as an example. And we certainly did that with this company SetWorks in that demonstration. So it makes sense to do it that way. And I think the other thing is, because these clients can be either web-based or mobile-based, you can make it available in the school without them having to have an EMR themselves. so they could have access to that data in a way that makes it accessible without having to have the most modern technology and have to do these integrations themselves. You can get the data where it needs to go in a secure way.
Thanks.
If anybody else has any
So-
comments on that.
So I think the problem is that, you know, as usual, Congress, you know, puts their head where the sun don't shine. And so they create law statutes that don't actually jive with the way the world works, right? So, you know, saying that all you have to have is an opt-in, opt-out, well, you know, now you're dealing with HIPAA, right? So if you don't know whether the person has an opt-in or an opt-out, you share data related to the information that's covered under an opt-in, opt-out, then you've created a HIPAA breach, right? And so, you know, prior for part 2, if you as a patient thought somebody breached your confidentiality and released records to somebody or whatever, in order to prosecute that, you had to go find a attorney general that would take up the case with a fine of $500, right, for the first offense. So that's and so if you go out and look at case law, you won't find any case law around part 2, right? Because no attorney general, you know, in their right mind is going to take a $500 case over a multi-million-dollar case, et cetera, right? And they're busy and they have their own things to worry about, right? So, you know, the problem really is that, you know, when Congress created this notion of, oh, we'll just do an opt-in, opt-out under HIPAA, because I'm sure a million providers told them that's what they needed to do. But you know, they don't get into the implementation details and concern themselves with what it takes to facilitate an opt-in, opt-out from a HIPAA perspective, right? So, you know, if I'm a provider in New York and the individual created an opt-in, right, and then information was exchanged, you know, how does a provider in California know whether they're opted in or opted out? And let's just say they opted in, shared some data, and then opted out. So are they opted in or are they opted out, right? So if you try to share new data, thinking that they're opted in, right, you've created a HIPAA breach. And we don't have an infrastructure to support that countrywide, right? You don't have you know, you don't have a place where you can go and say, you know, did Nancy, you know, do an opt-in so I can share more data, and or did they opt out and I can't share more data, right? You follow me? It just is a problem. They're trying to fix one problem and they create others, right? And so therein lies, you know, the issue with, you know, what Congress does, right? And then we try our best to you know, wrap our brains around the problem and figure out a solution, right? So there we go.
You know, the conversation has usually, well, oftentimes you come back to, do you need a national directory, right? So when I'm thinking about actual utilization of records, now healthcare is one thing, although I still have a belief anecdotally that the percentage of people who actually need to access their records away from home is pretty darn small. Anyway, so I don't know if yeah, I think we may be solving for a, you know, sort of a reverse Pareto here. But in terms of kind of social education, housing, nutrition, food, healthcare, all that stuff is, you know, it's pretty contained in a, you know, county or a set of counties. or even at a state level, I would think. And so I think that in order to get somewhere, I have a sense that we need to think on that level, right? Keeping the national in mind, but how do we effectuate that, for actual care coordination, recognizing their limitations?
Yeah, start small, put reasonable constraints on it, but also show high value and then test it, get feedback and test it.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts? I'll start calling on people, but no, I won't. But in terms of, with Kathy here from New York and Christine here from New Jersey and others from other, and Jennifer from Colorado, all interested in sort of implementation concepts. I just want to, now is the time to sort of blue sky kind of what the challenges are or what the opportunities would be. Is how do we jumpstart this? And in particular, are there things that we should really be carefully recommending? Thinking about, I want to go back to the scan for a second. So it's not just a hypothetical question, but we're not really, we're providing a broad brush of where we're at right now, but we also want to be pointing towards where we can go implement this on a proof of concept. And so what are the best options for success or consideration, as whether or not it's New York or New Jersey or Colorado or California, all have different systems, different laws, state laws are different. What is the set of stuff we should be helping them consider as they make these decisions? And I think you had some really good, upfront points on that in terms of consideration. I think we've covered some of those. We'll be interested in your thoughts on how you convey that in the scan and just your thoughts on that. But I want to just throw that open and see if anyone has particular suggestions or questions around that in terms of on the implementation side.
I think that Daniel, to follow up on your point about thinking locally versus thinking nationally. On the one hand, obviously a local implementation is where anything needs to start. On the other hand, getting the collaboration of like big technology companies, whether they're in the education tech area or foster care or whatever, and getting them to kind of change their data schema or adopt this standard or adopt that is kind of challenging. It creates its own challenges, right? Whereas, when the opportunity in healthcare is that, the healthcare industry is already thinking about how do we achieve kind of nationwide healthcare interoperability, and consent is, they're doing that, and that's where TEFCA has been created, right? So I think that there's kind of an opportunity to kind of do a small implementation, kind of focusing on the INCA requirements, being very narrowly focused. Okay, what is CMS really requiring? And then saying, okay, this can be expanded by looking at kind of more national governance frameworks, trust agreements, et cetera, where you're going to get the economies of scale, where ed tech vendors will say, hey, there might be a market for this. Maybe I should join this conversation, right? Maybe I should put some money into interoperability with the healthcare sector, right? So I think that's kind of the tension of, because the challenge of just doing this many, many different times locally without having real kind of convening across the sectors just around standards, right? Not just within healthcare, but you need that, you need a certain amount of, an incentive, you need a carrot to get people to play ball and scale. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, and I think that our outreach and over the years, recognizing that that it has to happen with federal involvement, with state involvement, with local, with industry. It really needs that, because if we do it without those things, then we're pushing water uphill for sure. And across, as Paul mentions here, a lot of other systems to address here, as well as we move forward there. So yeah, that's definitely true.
And I would add to that, in targeting that POC, target POCs that show really high value to all the people involved. They all end up, really singing the praises of what it's accomplished, and they see the benefits that they didn't even foresee. And that kind of user story in the end will make for a very successful pilot.
Dwayne, do you have any thoughts on what would get the educational technology companies and the standards people in education to the table around real healthcare interoperability?
So yeah, I mean, it's really just a use case, right? That's what you need. You need a real use case and somebody actually doing it. I don't think standards are in the way. I don't think it's people in the way. The processes, laws, MOUs, right? Those things all stand in the way. I don't think it would be much to make that leap. I think EdFi, CIF, CDS, all would be open, but I think we need a use case. I think that's kind of why I'm here, right? This is a potential use case for moving education data to a health sector. So I'm interested in the actual use case, but I think that's all that's really needed is for that to actually become a need and to show that there is a need for that. I mean, there's already education data moving like to Department of Human Services in nearly every state, from state education agencies over to the Department of Human Services, because it's required by law for identifying students who are foster or identifying students who are on supplemental nutrition benefits, right? So data is already moving back and forth between these agencies, albeit through flat files and stuff. So it just needs to be somebody willing to take up and do this use case, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to add a few words. That is a project that I'm involved with, the ONC LEAP grant for this year. We are mainly focused on interoperability between different formats of health data. And I'm not talking about FHIR here. What we're dealing with is XML files, CDAs, and even CSV files, Excel spreadsheets being exchanged between organizations. And the idea to semantically harmonize this so that you can run analytics and research data, create research databases from this. But on a larger scale, this approach allows merging in things like social determinants of health data or education data and relate it with the health data, the underlying health data. So there is this interoperability project going on. This started this year. So it might be interesting to investigate approaches like that, the semantic interoperability, semantic harmonization approaches, because I do not believe standardization is the issue here, but there will always be multiple incompatible standards. And a solution that accepts this fact and works with multiple standards is the key. It's not just one person comes up and figures out a standard. The next day there's going to be a new one. So I think the point is to work with multiple standards and have the multiple standards talk to each other.
I
completely agree. Yeah. And I think we keep trying to drive to a single standard, and we're defeating ourselves. Instead of thinking about what do we actually need the data to do, and what are we able to do with technology. And we're not limited to the old school data warehouses where we have to normalize or standardize or even harmonize data in order to put it all in there. We have the ability to take that data in the form that it comes in, be able to work with it and transform it based upon what we need it to do. And so in doing that, we can bring in social services data, we can bring in healthcare data. If we want to send that data back, the social services to healthcare, we can translate it into FHIR. If we want to take that HL7 healthcare data and move it someplace else, we can harmonize it, but we can do that on the output instead of the input so that it's much more thoughtful and we're not limiting what that data does. So the form should not limit what we do with the data. We've got the flexibility there.
Absolutely. I'm, could not agree more. And it's nice to hear that what the approach we've taken at our HIE is exactly that. We take V2 feeds, we take CCDs, we take flat files. We'll take it any way you can give it to us.
Yep.
And we will dump it into our data warehouse, which is a Python-based searchable situation, not structured. It's key pair based, and we can tag it and manipulate it and harmonize it once it's there. And then we put it back out in direct messages, in Excel files, in CSV files, in, CCDs or any other way that the end user wants to get it, needs to get it based on their system's capabilities. So it works for us. It works real world. We do, we've added housing data into our HIE stuff. We, we're consistently doing things like looking at shelter addresses when we get in, a record from a hospital and putting a homeless flag on that when it's a shelter address. So there, the technology can support this. You just need the flexibility that Mary Sarah was talking about, because that has to underlie everything.
Yeah.
Right. And Eric Yan here. We're actually convening an ontology work group. We do it every 2 months, and many of you, including Barak and Jim St. Clair and others, are already members of it. But we have sub tasks, subsets of the group who are working on mappings between different ontologies and areas, including healthcare. We have a new ontology for homeless management information systems that I worked on, and Neem, I just heard, is finishing by the end of this year an RDF representation that we'll be able to work with as well. So promising developments in that area that's all compatible with the larger products, for consent that we've described today. So thank you.
Go, Eric. Who said ontologies wasn't sexy? It's great. It's great. It's a great group, and it's
yeah, wonderful. And add to that too that the object management group, which is where the e-consent initiative is, has lots of ontology efforts in RDF and OWL and Shackle and others that all fit in with us too.
So Jim, you have some new news?
Oh yeah, for those who didn't hear, I'm moving to be the executive director for Linux Foundation Public Health, and open in that capacity to be able to still collaborate with you. So
great.
Congratulations. That's
Thank
amazing.
It's great.
Good to hear.
So can a point of personal privilege I'll take for a sec, just to say that a number of you on this call, and we'll send out an all points bulletin, still have sort of little things straggling in the document that I think most of them are literally 5 minutes, but if people could just check to see if there are questions that relate to what the content they provided, that'll be very helpful.
Thanks, Alan. And yeah, we'll put out that note. If you put a comment in, know that it's been looked at, been chewed on, and it may be unresolved at some point. So we're trying to be respectful of their voice, of everyone's voice here.
Absolutely. Most comments are resolved. There's not a lot left there. So if anybody needs to skim it, you'll be able to do that and see the comments, and it isn't a lot there.
One last pitch I would make is we're populating this with different graphical images, and we're asking folks who are presented at these events as other places. If there's stuff that really represents a concept or the concept that you're writing about, feel free to send that along, and we'll obviously give attribution to it. But it also makes it easier to read the paper. The pictures are very helpful, and so we've got a bunch. But we certainly are welcome next couple of days if something comes to mind like that really describes it. We'll make sure we include that in there.
Yep.
Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot of territory. Thanks, Nancy, so much for your presentation. We'll post the work on the hub, assuming we can post the slides and the recording there for folks who want to sort of share it with other folks. And with that, we'll see. Next week we have Amanda. I think we have Brian's presentation.
Hold on just a second.
Yeah, what is?
No, next week is Direct Trust with Scott Stewie.
Right.
Then it's Brian.
Yeah, so we have Direct Trust next week, and if there's folks that if there's other folks that we should be listening, hearing from around some of these topics, we're hoping to hear back a little bit more from ONC about some of the direction they're going post-tech, the post-tech forum. And I know their interest in consent is very significant, as is other folks there. So other federal agencies. So send along your suggestions, or if there's particular use cases or folks doing really good work that we want to feature, that will also be wonderful to hear and see as well.
And we will do a little show and tell next week. We'll show you on this screen, you will see the designed version, at least near final draft of the report everybody's been working on. That'll be fun.
Yep. All right, then. I think that's it for the day. Be well. Talk to you soon. And thanks for joining.
Yeah. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.